So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union, today focusing solely on the outcome of the European Council that has just ended. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, is Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies at the EPC. We don't have Fabian Zulig with us this week. He couldn't join us, but we have two special guests. Delighted later on to welcome Amanda Paul, Senior Policy Analyst and Deputy Head of the EPC's Europe in the World programme, and Mihai Chihaia, who is policy analyst specialising in, among other things, European and security defence policies at the EPC. And we're going to talk to them later on about the two biggest issues that EU leaders discussed at the summit, namely Ukraine and security and defence policy. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. A reminder, if you want to ask a question, you can either click on the raised hands button and I will ask you to unmute yourself when the time comes, or click on the Q&A button and write your question. And please, as always, a plea to be as brief as possible so it's easy for me to see what your question is and who it is for. Okay, let us get underway as we discuss the Spring Summit, signs of strength or disunity. So Janis, before we bring in our guests to discuss the key issues in depth, just give me a sense of what was on the agenda at this summit and your feeling about whether this was a meeting where the EU showed its strength or once again, as has happened a number of times in recent months, showed some signs of the cracks that are appearing on key issues.
Well, first of all, I think that you can clearly see that there still are cracks on some of the major issues. That hasn't changed. I think, as we have discussed in the past, there's often a strategic or structural disunity on many issues. But the summit in general, I think, was rather unspectacular. There were no big dramas. That was different to what we have experienced in some of the summits over the past months since the end of last year, which I think is also in many ways indicative of the fact that we're moving towards the hot phase of the EP elections. So I think there is a conscious attempt not to have any drama, but rather to show that one is progressing, moving on, and trying to send signals of unity, again, despite many of the differences. But even though this wasn't a spectacular summer, there were a lot of things which were on the agenda and which are reflected also in the European Council conclusions. So obviously they discuss Ukraine, security and defense, which we will go deeper together with colleagues, but they also discussed Middle East. They had an exchange on enlargement and reform, on migration. They endorsed the policy priorities of the growth survey in the context of the European semester. They had an exchange on agriculture. This morning they had a Euro summit, which is taking place twice a year, as we all know, together with Lagarde. And they had an exchange about the strategic agenda. So you see, they had a lot of things on their plate, which are reflected in the Council conclusions. But again, I think on many topics, the outcome is not showing strength, and it is often the product of disunity among the 27 on many of the key topics.
Just to come back to the Middle East question. There are summit conclusions. In December, EU leaders were so divided, there was no language at all on the Middle East conflict. There were some conclusions. There was a call, and I quote, for an immediate humanitarian pause leading to a sustainable ceasefire, the unconditional release of all hostages, and the provision of humanitarian assistance. Just clarify for me, this is slightly different to the US draft resolution to the United Nations, which I think called for an immediate ceasefire. Why that word pause, which caused so much division and dispute late last year? And do you think that this conclusion reflects a growing sense of unity on what needs to be done, or once again, are they papering over the cracks?
Well, first of all, these conclusions are a compromise. They're a compromise between the sides which are still having a different opinion with respect to how critical to be of Israel, how supportive to be of the Palestinian people. So it is a compromise. It doesn't go as far as the US position, clearly. So what you were quoting is what is indicating, which is that you connect the humanitarian pause with a sustainable ceasefire, and that's the compromise they could find. But at least they didn't have an outright fight. They were able to easily conclude on the council conclusions, despite their differences. And I think the biggest signal which they were trying to convey, which you could also see in the press conference of Michel and von der Leyen yesterday evening, but also in some of the things we've heard from individual heads of state and government, was to call on the Israeli government to refrain from launching an operation in Rafah. That's the signal I wanted to send out. The question is whether the Israeli prime minister and his government are listening to what Europeans are saying. But that, I think, is the signal which they want to send out, and they agreed on that. I think that is at least something which is positive. But again, there are huge differences. Today, at close to the end of the summit, we also heard that the Spanish, the Irish, the Slovenians are ready to recognize Palestine when the circumstances are right. And if you compare that to the positions which you have in other member states, and notably also in Berlin, obviously there are huge differences among the 27, but at least they're not fighting anymore as they did after October 7, when there were severe differences among them.
Thank you very much. One other issue of those you mentioned I'd like to touch on before we bring in Amanda to discuss Ukraine was the question of agriculture and farmers. You said Michel said in his invitation letter to the summit to EU leaders, he said, "We need to," and I quote, "ensure progress is made without delay in addressing the concerns that have prompted the protests by farmers." I think they talked about it today, and I think there was quite a lot of reference to it in the press conferences. What did they discuss, and did they decide anything concrete?
Well, yes, they had an exchange on the concern of farmers on agricultural policy, and yes, in the press conference, in today's press conference, especially Ursula von der Leyen, but also Charles Michel, but especially Ursula von der Leyen, was making a lot of references to the concerns of farmers, and that the European Union, that the heads of state are taking these concerns very seriously, that they are engaging with them. And also in the council conclusions, you will have a section which refers to it, where they underline the importance of the agricultural sector, where they say that they will reduce administrative burden, where they strengthen the position of farmers when it comes to the food supply chain, and also the position of farmers when it comes to negotiating with those who determine the prices of their products. And so there's a lot of references. There is a strong signal towards farmers that we're taking your concerns seriously. We will continue to review the issues which you're having. So there's a strong signal. And again, let's not forget where all this is happening in just a couple of weeks months before the EP election. So they want to give the strong signal of, we take you seriously, we take your concerns seriously, and we try to do our best. Let's see what will come out of that.
And there was also a decision earlier this week on imports from Ukraine, agricultural imports. I want to come back to that in our discussion in a moment, but another clear signal there to the farmers, but also a somewhat confusing signal, I think, for the Ukrainians. But let's come back on that. On that note, let us bring in Amanda Paul to talk about Ukraine. So again, and let me quote from Charles Michel's invitation letter, when he said this was a pivotal moment in Russia's war against Ukraine, and he said, "Urgency, intensity, and unwavering determination are imperative." So, Amanda, great to have you back with us on Update. Was it a pivotal summit? Did it turn out to be such? And were EU leaders showing that urgency, intensity, and determination that Charles Michel called for?
I mean, I can answer that in one word: no. Russia is escalating while we see the EU still differing and divided. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is incredibly serious. Probably many of you have seen the latest attacks on Zaporizhia overnight, massive missile attacks. There's ongoing attacks in Kharkiv. There's been the biggest ever attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. There's also regular attacks on Kiev. There isn't the air defense systems to protect these cities, to protect civilians and infrastructure. And as we know, Ukraine is running out of ammunition. There's something like a 1-to-6 parity, missiles and etc. These are things we all know. But unfortunately, despite all of the talk, all of the bravado statements, such as Michel's, we are just not seeing these words transformed into concrete actions. There's still ongoing discussions and divisions over where the money is going to come from to buy more arms, how we're going to speed up production. I still don't see that the EU or member states are ready to put their economies on a military footing or a war footing. Of course, I don't want to group all of the countries together because there are some member states that have done an outstanding job, the Baltic states, Poland, and others on the eastern flank. We've seen the very good initiative from the Czech president for the ammunition coalition. We've seen these important bilateral assurance packages. But I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we need to times this by 1 billion. This is a pivotal moment for Ukraine, for the EU, for the reputation of the EU, but for European and international security. I mean, the EU needs to stop messing around and actually do what it says it's going to do and give Ukraine what it needs.
Yeah. Let us come back on that question of military assistance, on that question of money in a moment in more detail. But Janis, would you share Amanda's immense, I think, anger and frustration that I'm hearing about the conversation? I mean, it is quite striking that when they talk about the urgent needs that Ukraine have, they then say welcomes all recent initiatives in this regard. And then a lot of the references are to things, as Amanda was mentioning, that are bilateral, that individual member states are doing rather than the EU. How do you read it? And are you as frustrated by EU leaders' response as Amanda is?
No, I agree with, clearly agree with Amanda. And I think also if you listen to what you hear from Ukraine itself, you will hear a lot of frustration. And you will also hear and clearly get the signal that the EU is not doing enough. They had a video meeting with Zelensky also during the summit, and I'm sure that he gave exactly that that reflection to them and shared that with him, with the EU leaders, that yes, we need your support. Yes, you reiterate that you will fully support us. If you look into the Council conclusions, it's full of that Russia must not prevail, and we need to speed up our delivery of military assistance, that we condemn Russia. All that is there. But if you then see how much actually is being done, and Amanda was reminding us very correctly, collectively is being done, because some individual member states are doing immensely a lot. And here geopolitics obviously matter. But if you take them as a sum, the EU 27, I don't think that it is enough. And I'm sure we're going to discuss details. You also see of how different the opinions are among the 27. And the product of that is that we're actually nice in words, but we're not delivering actually what these words are conveying. We're not being firm enough. And I fear that if the situation continues to deteriorate in Ukraine, we potentially might lose the train of the moment where we should have done more. And that is very unfortunate. So I understand that Amanda is not only frustrated, but potentially also angry.
But is this really a result of a handful of member states who are firmly against really increasing, and when it comes to the type of military assistance, certain things that they keep ruling out for different reasons, and that actually it's okay because a lot of countries are doing things bilaterally, Amanda? We talked about the military assistance side. I want to come on in a moment to the Ukrainian Assistance Fund, where a lot of the money in that pot is actually bilateral money. I mean, as long as it's getting there, isn't it okay, even if it can't be done at EU level? Or is it very important that this is done and we see the unity of the EU 27?
I mean, I do think it's important to see unity of EU 27. I mean, okay, it's great to get things bilaterally, but working as one is important for the image and prestige of the EU, and the fact that the EU itself has said this is a priority, that they want to deliver for Ukraine. They want to do everything they can for Ukraine, and they're not doing everything they can for Ukraine. I mean, you mentioned some of the weapons that Ukraine needs, but they still haven't received. For example, the famous Taurus missiles. which Ukraine has been asking for a long time, as well as other, long-range missiles and whatnot. These weapons are really important to be able to strike Russian supply lines and depots. I still think there is some concerns from some member states about them being used too deep into Russia. I think it's time that we put these concerns to bed. Let's get rid of them, because these concerns are costing lives. They are costing lives of soldiers who don't need to die, and they are costing civilian lives, and it's wasting time. The EU needs to really get its act together. They need to start producing more arms, the defense industry. I know this is an argument that's been talked about for a very long time, but I still don't see this happening. And it needs to start happening. As I said, we need to get onto a war footing, onto a war economy. The Russians are doing, or President Putin is doing, I should say, everything he can. He's thrown everything into this war. The country is on a war footing. Factories that used to make bread are now making bullets. The EU needs to follow this line, or Ukraine is going to suffer the major consequences of this weakness. And that's what it is. It's weakness.
On the military assistance question, Janis, are we seeing any greater convergence on, because part of the argument is what you rule in and what you rule out. And famously, we had President Macron last month saying nothing is ruled out, even in terms of a presence on the ground. Is that at the heart of the reason why so much of this has to be done bilaterally? And do you believe, as Amanda does, that it's very important that the EU is seen to do it as one rather than stepping up? If the only way round some objections from some member states is bilateral action, as long as it gets there, isn't that the important thing?
No, I think we need EU unity, but we also need concerted EU action. So when Amanda is reminding us of the fact that we need to invest more into our defense industry in order to be able to, and not at some point in time, now, we need to act quickly. That is also about being able to actually help the Ukrainians and being ready to support them. But there still is, I think, and that's, I think, the massive and which that goes to the heart of the problem. There are severe differences among member states. If you look into the debates also in key member states, you will see that there are positions which are not in harmony with what you hear when you go to the Baltic countries or when you go to Poland. When you witness the debate which we're having in Germany, obviously it is not in harmony what President Macron is telling us. And so there are severe differences between member states, and that is not only undermining unity in terms of the political stance they take, but I think it's also undermining the level of ambition we have when it comes to walking the walk, when it comes to supporting Ukraine, but also when it comes to developing the defense industry, which we talk about.
We'll come back to the defense industry question.
And by the way, if you still have people who say, let's freeze the conflict, for me, that tells me that one has not really still understood what all this is about and what Putin is trying to achieve. And also that we have not understood that it's not the Ukrainians' war, but it's our war. It is not something which is far away. It is our concern. It needs to be our concern. And this is not the message which we're conveying. It's not the position which we all share.
Okay. Just on the question of money, Amanda, there was this agreement this week on a new €5 billion European Ukraine Assistance Fund to finance new arms shipments, and it was described by a lot of critics as a masterpiece of repackaging and relabeling. And this comes back to the question of doing it at EU level or doing it bilaterally, because as I understand it, in this assistance fund, if a member state is giving money or assistance to the Ukraine, that counts, and they don't have to give more through the peace fund. So is that criticism fair? Is this just a repackaging, or was that a significant move forward in terms of help for Ukraine?
No, I would tend to agree with you that it is rather a bit of repackaging. And there needs to be a much greater political will and readiness to actually find a way to give more money to Ukraine for arms. I mean, there was discussion there about the European Investment Bank to have a sort of defense bond, I think it's called, which would allow them to buy more arms for Ukraine. But there was disagreements between member states over how to go forward with it. I mean, lending to defense companies, sorry, but there was disagreements between different member states. So again, if my memory serves me correctly, this discussion has been pushed back till June. That's a fat lot of good for the Ukrainians, right? Which again, you know, shows a lack of, I mean, the lack of urgency in this discussion. I mean, it pains me to say that, but I have to say that. And I also wanted to say something about President Macron. I mean, he's been very loud in the last couple of weeks, talking about we have no more red lines, strategic ambiguity. But actually, in terms of actions and what France has delivered to Ukraine, it's still very little. If you look at France's GDP and you compare that to what they've actually given Ukraine, I mean, the French could be doing much more. So please, President Macron, you know, let's stop the talking and let's start the delivering.
On the question of money as well, where are we in the discussion of the use of frozen Russian assets to provide support to Ukraine, Amanda? I mean, I think there's an argument about whether it's the assets themselves or just the revenue they generate. And then there's another argument about what proportion of it goes on what. Can you just clarify where we are with that? And then, Janis, I'll bring you back in.
Yeah, I mean, this was a good piece of good news that came out of the summit, so it's something I don't have to complain about, right? They did reach an agreement that the windfall, or let's say the interest that has been made on the frozen assets can be used or given to Ukraine, and this is good. And as far as I'm aware, the first, I think, amount will be delivered in July. I think it's 3 billion or something like this. And how it's actually going to be carved up, it still remains to be seen. But I think it will be divided to some extent between military assistance and reconstruction. I understand that the Hungarian Prime Minister, of course, you know, created a bit of a hullabaloo because he had his, you know, opposition to this in the first place, but he came up with some sort of compromise of some of the money would have to be used for peacekeeping missions or something along those lines in different member states. But I mean, this is a positive development. Of course, there is still a risk attached to it because somewhere down the line, the Russians could actually take the international actors to court on this topic. So it's a bit risky. So it's good to see the EU taking a risk, which is good for Ukraine. And they need this money. They really need this money.
Absolutely. Janis, a reaction to that and that one piece, as Amanda says, of good news from the summit. And then I want to come back to the issue of agriculture and Ukrainian foodstuffs. But on this issue of both you know, the money generally and specifically this question of the profits from Russian assets.
No, it clearly is positive news, but let's not forget that in the Council conclusion, it says the European Council conclusions, it says that the Council is invited to take work forward. That's a quote. So there still is an opportunity for those in the Council. Amanda was correctly referring to Hungary and to Viktor Orban's government. But you also have other member states who are not critical, but are worrisome of the signal that's sending. If you look into Malta, Ireland, which has to do with their neutrality status. So there are still some hurdles which will have to be overcome. But even if this is positive news, although these hurdles still need to be overcome, we're talking about an amount which is significant, but it's by no means sufficient. So it is positive news. But the question is how much more needs to be done. And let's not forget that these decisions have to be taken also in the upcoming months. Again, this is linked to the EP elections, and a lot of governments do not want to send a strong signal of support towards Ukraine because in the national debates, they fear that that might cost them in the elections. So we have a lot of politics which is playing into this, and national politics which is playing into it. And that I think will not get less over the upcoming months. It will increase. And I think even after the EP elections, if the outcome is the way we think that it will be, i.e. that radical right-wing anti-EU forces will do well during these elections, I'm not sure that the situation afterwards will be easier when it
Indeed,
comes to this topic.
and you pointed there to that language, take forward. Quite
Yes.
striking, actually. I hope we'll come back to this with Mihai shortly. When we look at what was said on, for example, the defence industrial base, it was very swiftly advanced, take forward without delay. In this case, it was simply take forward. Without that sense of urgency that perhaps one would like to see. But just sticking with giving what seemed to me to be a case almost this week of giving Ukraine with one hand and taking away with another, and probably linked to the elections, the decision on Ukrainian imports of grain, and then linked to a decision at the council, maybe trying to offset that, on imports of Russian and Belarusian agriculture. Janis, how do you read that? And is this just linked to the European elections?
Well, I think it is something which we've also seen in the past. So it's not something which is only linked to the elections, but it is obviously linked to internal political concerns. And it's not only Viktor Orban who's playing his usual game of obstruction in order to get something in return, but it's also in other places. Look into the French and the Polish government, which is trying to signal to its farmers, and which obviously are voters, and not only the farmers, but also the rural areas in which farming is strong, to signal to these voters, yes, we're fighting for your interests, we hear your concerns, and that then translates also into decisions which have to do with Ukraine. So you're sending a double signal, and you're actually acting in double ways. On the one hand, you're sending a signal to your farmers of support in contrast to what the Ukrainians are asking for. At the same time, you try to, and you actually agree to provide more support to Ukrainians. So it's a lot of politics which plays into this. It's also money, but it's a lot of politics which motivates them, these actions, and I think it's sending the wrong signal.
So one wrong signal there. And Amanda, when it comes to the accession negotiations with Ukraine, with Moldova, the perceived Commission foot dragging, trying to push this as it is seen to beyond the European elections, not wanting to make significant progress. How is that? What impact is that having in Ukraine and in Moldova? And these ideas, Commission proposals and ideas that are floating around now for sort of gradual membership, with sort of partial membership leading to more as we go along. How is all that playing in both countries?
I will answer that, Jackie, but I just wanted to say one sentence on the previous question.
Yeah, sure.
Why are we still importing Russian and Belarus products? We shouldn't be importing any of them. Let's do away with them. We don't need them, and it would send a very strong signal. But on your question, it's a major error not to swiftly adopt the negotiating frameworks for Ukraine and Moldova. I mean, the EU has said that enlargement is a geopolitical imperative, and this statement came about directly as a consequence of Russia's full-scale invasion. So we need to proceed rapidly with the necessary political will and not fall back into the trap that we were in before with the Western Balkans. I mean, the Western Balkans need to also be processed, but we need to deliver. Moldova's situation is very bad now. What happens in Ukraine spills over into Moldova. They have elections coming up in the fall, and the Russians are already launching full-scale, let's say, disinformation campaigns. So there's a lot at stake here. The EU cannot afford to fall at the first hurdle. This is literally the first hurdle, right? They need to start cracking on.
Amanda, is your sense this again is linked to the elections, as some people do link it and say they don't want to make progress before, and that afterwards things will speed up significantly? Or is your sense that this is just the first of many delays?
I mean, I sense it could be the first of many delays. It would be very wishful thinking that there wouldn't be any delays, or that the EU approach to enlargement would be, let's say, 100% different to what it was before. But maybe we could expect some delay before the European Parliament elections, but I think this is the wrong approach, because it sends a very bad signal to Kiev and to Chisinau, they need to see that the EU is behind. It's important for their reform processes. So this needs to take priority over everything else. Perhaps that's my wishful thinking as well. And when it comes to the second point of your question, I mean, to be honest, as you said, this discussion's been going around for a long time, and I'm not opposed to it. But I mean, it shouldn't replace the actual proper enlargement process with eventual membership.
Yeah.
There are many benefits to be had from gradual integration into different parts of the EU, into different sectors. I mean, sectoral integration into the defence and security sector, for example. But it has to go to the end. They need to get the full shebang and be members. And this also requires the EU to do its part of this, which is carry out the necessary reform to make themselves fit.
I want to come to that point.
Both need to get fit.
Yeah, Janis was tweeting with some frustration during the summit about the language on that parallel process of enlargement reform. We should mention, by the way, an important decision at the summit to open accession negotiations with Bosnia-Herzegovina. So a step forward there, something that's been long awaited as well. But Janis, I mean, you might want to say 2 words about that. But on this question of the parallel process, so we talked about the sense in Ukraine and Moldova the EU is foot dragging on opening the accession negotiations. Also a concern there when you say that internal reform and enlargement must go in parallel, that the EU, when you look at the language at this summit, they took stock of preparations for both, will address internal reforms at an upcoming meeting, quotes, with a view to adopting by summer 2024 conclusions on a roadmap. So with a view to adopting conclusions, not to actually doing anything. Again, is this language that indicates this is going to be a very slow process? And I have to ask again, because of the elections, let's not open up that Pandora's box pre-election, or is there something more serious going on here?
Well, it was correct that let me start by saying that you referred to the decision to start negotiations with Bosnia. I think that is an overdue decision, and it's good that finally that decision was taken. The wording in the European Council conclusions, the final ones, differ from different drafts which we've seen before. So the concerns of some member states who do not want to send a clear signal that there's no automaticity, that the process that Bosnia needs to deliver. The wording has changed in that direction, but at least the decision was finally taken to start negotiations, so that's positive. When it comes to enlargement and reform, and the fact that there is an acknowledgement that these tracks need to advance in parallel, I think this is actually reflecting what needs to happen in reality, because enlargement is a geopolitical imperative. It needs to happen. That requires also a reform of the EU, but the EU in general needs to reform itself also because that is a geopolitical imperative looking at the world we live in. But there is no substantial progress when it comes to that. Obviously, this is linked also, again, to the elections, especially enlargement is being seen as a hot political potato, but also when it comes to EU reform, this is being seen as a hot political potato, so one doesn't want to touch on them. By the way, there's also no reference to the Commission's communication from Wednesday on pre-enlargement reforms and policy review, which is also interesting. But I'm asking myself, what will actually happen once the elections are behind us? Will the situation then be easier if the outcome of the election sees that a lot of critical EU voices have done well? Will that then help? Will that then create the political will and the leadership which is needed in order to actually progress when it comes to EU reform and enlargement? I have my severe doubts that we will have a substantial change of the overall situation of the narrative. If you look into the Commission's communication I just mentioned, I think it follows the right logic. It has striking the right tone. But if you look into detail, it's not very concrete when it comes to policy reviews. It explicitly says that an in-depth policy review on the behalf of the Commission will be done in 2025. So it's pushing the in-depth review further back. When it comes to EU reforms, it is by no means ambitious. It says that we need to use the full potential of the EU treaties. We need to use the passerelle clauses for QMV. This is all not new. So it's actually being extremely, extremely difficult. And I think we're losing time. And I don't think that that will massively change, even in the strategic agenda. My thinking is that it will be full of ambitions, but it will not be complete, because there is not an appetite, there is no leadership, there are no leaders which are pushing in that direction fiercely. So walking the walk, we're far away from that.
And we'll come back to that, because the April special European Council is supposed to be concentrating on the strategic agenda. So something I think at our post-summit update after that one, we will come back to. But Amanda, before I let you go, again, in terms of how this is seen from Ukraine, from Moldova, and now also potentially, as we see Bosnia-Herzegovina enter that group and the rest of the Western Balkans waiting, is it being perceived as alarming foot dragging? Is there real concern that the EU, you know, while they are working to reform themselves and do their homework, that the EU may not be moving fast enough to do its own? What's the reading of this from their side?
I mean, I would say there's definitely concerns, nervousness, because these countries are relying on the EU. They've basically invested their future in the EU, and the EU has made big promises in terms of their membership. So there's a responsibility from EU leaders to actually do what's written on the side of the tin, not put it off or change the recipe, because millions of citizens are counting on the EU delivering. Because let's remember, all these sorts of negative messaging or lack of strategic messaging, maybe I can phrase it better, from the EU is used by the Russians. They counter this with their own narratives, holding back on progressing the accession negotiations will be spun and put into the media in Russia and elsewhere in a very unuseful way, in a negative way, and it resonates with people. And as I said, Moldova has got elections in the fall. There's already a significant chunk of the Moldovan population that is actually pro-Russian. It's hard to believe, but there is. So the EU needs to support Chisinau as well as Ukraine to move this forward, because people need to see that this process is moving. Otherwise, the Russians will use it.
Thank you very much. And Amanda, always great to have you with us. We need to move on to the security and defense conversation. Sorry, Janis, you can perhaps join that point. But Amanda, thank you so much. Come back soon. Always great to have you. Thank you. And now I'm delighted that Mihai is joining us for our discussion on security and defense. And Amanda was talking there in the context of Ukraine about putting Europe's economy on a war footing and investing more in the defense industry. So a very clear link. But Mihai, if I could start in terms of what was discussed at the summit. And again, I'd like to quote from Charles Michel's invitation letter, because it always sets out his ambition for the summit. So it's a good measure. It's a good thing to measure against as we assess the outcome. He said in that letter, and I quote, "It is time for a real paradigm shift in relation to our security and defense." And he added, "The EU needs to take," quotes, "radical and concrete steps to be defense ready and put the EU's economy on a war footing." So is your reading and your sense from the discussions of the summit that it showed that sense of urgency, that strong leadership that he was calling for?
Firstly, thank you very much for having me. I think I'll be in the same boat as Amanda, and I'll say no. I mean, it's positive that many things were discussed or put on the table, such as the enhancing the defense industry, the new European defense industrial strategy, how to find funding for this, joint development of capabilities, procurement. But then, for me, this sense of urgency equals a swift implementation. And the swift implementation is not there. Some of the deficiencies in these areas that I mentioned have been there for many years. I think we can talk about the last 10 years since the EU instruments and different initiatives of defense starting to take place. These are not new, but there hasn't been much progress on these. And then I think the ultimate test on defense defense for the EU is money. How to fund this? How to fund the money to invest in this initiative? And I think there have been many disagreements at the council between member states. It's also not clear how much money is actually needed, but that's another discussion. And generally, I think there is no agreement between member states on how to proceed on all these issues. There, of course, all the member states agree that something needs to be done in this area. We need more joint procurement, joint development of capabilities. For instance, we need to expand our defense industry capabilities. But how to get to the end point, it's not clear for all of them.
Janis, I mean, we've talked about security and defense, and your frustrations at the slowness of progress in this area have been evident before. But I'm just wondering whether you feel that even if the disagreements remain, the sense that this Ukraine conflict now really could escalate, the concerns about a return of Donald Trump to the White House and what that might mean for the future of NATO, for example, are they beginning to galvanize EU thinking on this? Or do you share Mihai's concern that there are just too many divisions in too many areas?
Well, you know, my beard is white enough to remember the discussions we had in the 1990s. Mihai was referring to 10 years ago. Much earlier, we had discussions about what needs to be done when it comes to security and defense. And if you compare all these discussions we've had in the past, also during difficult periods, to the discussion today, I think there is an appreciation that the gravity of the situation is more severe and probably most severe than it had been over the past decades. So things are moving. However, having said that, also if you look into this European Council's conclusions, a lot of right and nice words, right objectives. It pushes the right buttons. We're committed to increasing the EU's defense readiness. We want to reduce strategic dependencies, scale up our capacities, strengthen the defense technological industrial base. These are all quotes from the European Council conclusions. Also, if you look into the communication from the Commission and the HRVP on European Defense Industrial Strategy, EDIS, if you look into that document, it has all the right objectives. But the question is if we actually are doing what we're setting as objectives. And here I have severe doubts. You were referring to the Trump factor. I think you can already sense, if you compare today's discussion to the discussion which started in November, December, when first recognition was there that potentially there might be Trump too. It became a real fear. If you compare the discussion of today to then, it is not as fearful, less panicking than it was some months ago. That is positive because panic is never a good source of advice. But I have the impression it is already giving the notion of, okay, at the end of the day, the likelihood of Trump 2 happening is not as big as we feared in October, November, December. I'm not saying this is quite correct. I'm just analytically saying this is my appreciation. Okay. So there is this feeling the worst will not happen. And then also listen to Trump himself, who says it's not about the US leaving NATO. It's if others, i.e. the Europeans, will deliver on their side. Yeah. So there's this feeling we might not have to do all this, and we're going to get around the worst of potential developments. And I think this is not only risky, I think it is dangerous, and it is politically showing a myopia when it comes to the situation we're potentially will be facing, with or without Trump.
Okay, Mihai, reaction to that, if you will, but also in terms of this phrase, defense ready. What does it actually mean? Because we see constant references to it now. What would it look like in practice? And you talked about swift implementation, moving from nice words to actually doing it. What are the steps if we to become genuinely defense ready? Is that putting Europe's economy on a war footing? What does it mean?
Maybe if I may first add just two points on what Janis said, because in the past day I've been in Estonia, and after many meetings with different officials, maybe one recurring idea, one recurring thought that came out was this lack of urgency in political decision making in many member states, and especially Western member states. And this points to the first aspect I want to mention, which is the mentality that simply doesn't reflect the sense of urgency, the threat that is existing now. And this mentality exists in some member states, which are, of course, mostly on the eastern flank, the Baltic countries, the Nordic countries, but the mentality is very different when we move west. And then second point I wanted to mention is about a lack of synchronization between short-term and long-term when we're talking about developing defense capabilities at the EU level. For instance, on the short term, of course, what we need is to replenish stocks. We need ammunition. We need capabilities. While on the long term, we need actually to invest in this European defense industrial base. And I think there are some member states that actually confuse these two, because on short term, when we say we need ammunition, for instance, we don't necessarily need European ammunition, right? We need ammunition as soon as possible. But on the long term, it's true, we need to invest in this European defense industrial base. Now, going back to your question on the defense readiness, I mean, what I can say, what it requires. It requires a full spectrum of capabilities, and then these strategic enablers that are mentioned, in military terms, these niche capabilities. Then, of course, you need full spectrum of capabilities available in maritime, terrestrial, air defense. Then you need the critical technologies. You need infrastructure. So basically, you need a full spectrum to be able to act decisively when a crisis arises. I think this is also the definition that is given in the European Defense Industrial Strategy. Now, how to achieve it? I mean, this is, of course, the difficult part. Firstly, of course, you need more defense spending from member states. You need more joint procurement, joint development of capabilities. You need more integration of the defense industries. And then you need, of course, swift decision making.
So are these all the key elements when we talk about the proposed European Defence Industrial Strategy? Are all those key elements there, Mihai? And how are member states reacting to it? I mean, we saw the summit called about swiftly advancing work on it, and also talked about taking forward the work on specifically on the investment program side of it, taking that forward without delay. Are all the right elements there? And does it look as if member states will put their money where their mouth is, as it were, and implement these things?
Well, yes, these are the elements of the European Defence Industrial Strategy. And I think generally among member states, there is agreement these things need to be done. But then, as it's being said, the devil is in the details. And one of these details is funding. And it's also the funding through this EDIEP, Defense Investment Program, which now is capped at 1.5 billion. Now 1.5 billion is pennies, basically, when we're speaking about the money that are needed. And there have been discussions how to get more money. One option is, of course, to look at the next MFF. But I think these will be difficult discussions. There were some numbers mentioned. I think Commissioner Breton mentioned 100 billion. But in fact, I don't think we know how much is needed. Do we need 100? Do we need 200? Do we need 300 billion? Do we need 300 billion per year? And a good example here is the German fund for defense of 100 billion. That, for instance, right after it was announced, and by the time implementation started, because of inflation, it was down to 80-something billion. And I think up to now, there are mixed results in its implementation. So we see that definitely this number is enough. Then the question is, how do we calculate the numbers? How do member states can agree on this number? I don't have the answer to this. I don't think anyone has it at this point, but it's definitely something that we need to think about.
Janis, you wanted to come in?
Yes. Taking the German example, 100 billion, 5 years, inflation, actual investments, if you now, and we're talking about more than 2 years since the announcement of the German Chancellor, and you look into the investments that have been done and need to be done in the Bundeswehr, we're far away, and the 100 billion is by no means sufficient. And no one knows, by the way, what happens when the 5 years are over, because the Bundeswehr will continue to need investment into its infrastructure, into its capacities. And I take that as an example because it shows that on the one hand, we lack European cooperation, but also national developments are not at speed to what we actually need. And when you look into the European level, the cooperation among EU or European member states, I would second what Mihai was saying when he was sharing with us his impression from discussions he's having in Estonia, where he is currently, that there is an appreciation in Estonia, but also other Eastern European countries, that there is no joint sense of what the emergency actually is. And this is correct. It is the right appreciation, because if you talk to people from countries which are geopolitically further away from the conflict in Ukraine, obviously the sense of urgency is not the same. Which, by the way, also means if you put yourself into the position of those who actually worry, that the level of trust towards the others in the European Union is extremely low. And if you have a very low appreciation of trust towards the other, actually, there is a fundamental problem which you need to be overcoming. And let's not also forget, it's a lot of money we're talking about. So everyone is also shielding their own defense industry. And it's not only the big players who are being shielded, it's also the small players which are being shielded in the defense industry. So we know what we need to do. And actually, we knew for a long time what we need to do, but we just don't know how we will get there. And as long as we do not try to address the differences among ourselves and openly discuss and address them, we will not be able to overcome them. And when it comes to the money issue, and that is obviously clear, there is the question of joint borrowing, which the French, supported by the Belgians, the Italians, the Greeks, the Polish, the Estonians, are arguing in favor of, and you have the others who are against it. The frugals, minus Finland, which has a more differentiated position to this compared to the frugals coalitions in the past. So what we're seeing is we are having the right discussions. We know what we need to do, but actually we do not have neither the leadership, nor the trust in each other, nor the political will to do what we need to actually do when it comes to money.
Can I just ask one question about the European Investment Bank? Amanda referred to it earlier.
Yes.
And there is this line in the conclusion saying the European Investment Bank is invited to adapt its policy for lending to the defence industry and its current definition of dual-use goods while safeguarding its financing capacity. Is this the green light for a change in the EIB's mandate in order to be able to fund the defence industry? Or is that nuanced language there half a green light? Mihai, how do you read that?
I read it as a call for the European Investment Bank to figure out, to propose some ways to overcome this this issue of not being able to invest directly in defense. Then, of course, to be able to do this, then it will need at some point, of course, agreement between member states. I think we're talking about a simple majority to change the mandates. But at the same time, I think there are a couple of ways for the European Investment Bank to do this. I think the easy way is sort of to, when we're talking about investing in dual use, to just shift the focus more towards defense. For instance, we'd be talking about, for instance, it's just an example, 10% civilian, 90% military. This would still be dual use, and it won't need a mandate. That will be sort of the easy way. Then there's a second way, which is for the European Investment Bank to change the mandates and invest in military defensive equipment. And what I mean by this would be, for instance, cyber capabilities, military infrastructure, satellites, so everything non-lethal. For this, it would need a change in mandate and a vote of simple majority, and at least, I think, 50% of the capital. I think this would be possible. I think there is agreement between at least 14 member states to do this. And then there is another option, the last option, which is probably the biggest change. That would be a complete change of mandate. So the European Investment Fund basically will invest in full-fledged military capabilities and ammunition.
Okay, okay.
So,
Just, Janis, I know you want to come in briefly if you would, because I want to look a little bit to the future now. And just throw in a question from someone in our audience who remains nameless. The Russians are willing to ship people from the global south country to build weapons. Should EU member states be willing to do the same to increase our capacity? We're coming back here really to the issue of what does a war footing mean, and do we have the manpower, the labor force, in order to deliver a war footing economy? I don't know whether you have a brief reaction to that, but I think you wanted also to react on this EIB question briefly, if you would.
Well, first of all, it's very good that Mihai elaborated the different options which are there. But I think in general, what we will see is that there will be some form of progress when it comes to the EIB, when it comes to defense spending, because it actually is among the easiest way to do it. Because when it is about, having an MFF, as Mihai, you were alluding toward, which actually increases substantially in order to be able to support defense cooperation at the European level, is something which is politically extremely difficult because it requires member states to pay for it. And we saw the discussion we had on the midterm review of the MFF, how difficult these discussions were. And we were talking about totally different sums if you compare these discussions, which at the time were related to Ukraine and other aspects of the review, to what we would need in the defense industry. The other option is that you increase national budgets. That is something which is not very popular because people say invest into social issues, into infrastructure, rather than into the military. That is a lot of what you hear in public discussion, especially in Western European countries. And when it comes to joint borrowing, this is also an extremely difficult path because a good number of member states actually do not want it. So the logic of we can do something along the lines of what we had with Next Generation EU, I think also will not fly. So you go for the easiest option. And I think that is the EIB. The question is this enough? And actually it is not enough. Thus, we will, I think, see progress on the EIB, but that is by far not equivalent to what we actually need, where member states are not willing to, again, walk the walk.
One last question to you both, and Mihai, let me come to you first. Ursula von der Leyen has talked about having a defense commissioner should she get her second term. What difference do you think that could make, if any? Does it depend on who has the job? What will determine whether that makes a difference or not? And in terms of where we go from here on the strategy, what's the time frame? What's the next step?
Well, I think that the defense commissioner is definitely a good step, a good proposal. It would show the increased attention and role of the EU in defense. But then I think it needs a definition of its portfolio. What will be under this defense commissioner? Would it be just a commissioner for the defense industry, or it will have more competencies? For instance, this of course might require also some more structural change in the commission. And one example that comes to mind is the European Defence Agency, which is currently under the HRVP. Would this mean that it will shift and go under this new defense commissioner? I think these are all valid questions.
I mean, in a way, if the High Representative job is a split portfolio, as it were, a commissioner, and then this would need to be the same, wouldn't it? It would need to have some element of EAS and some element of commission.
Yes, but then I think it requires these structural changes. How do you actually split, for instance, the EAS? How do you split the people there? We need to, I think, to think this through. And then, as you mentioned, I think a decisive factor will be who will be the first person who will get the job. How will they shape it? I mean, I think there's the Polish are interested in the position, and I'm sure others as well. I think it will be very important how this is being shaped by the first.
And Mihai, just in terms of what happens next, do EU leaders come back to this issue of the strategy again? Are they promising to come back to it at a summit? What's the next step?
Yes, I think they will come back to it in June, and until then, the Commission needs to come back with more ideas on funding, financing. By then, I think get a clear picture how we'll move forward with the European Investment Bank. And here I have to agree with Janis. The European Investment Bank in itself won't be enough.
Janis, just on this question of a defence commissioner, what difference could it make? What difference is it likely to make? And how do they resolve these complexities of the relationship between, as I say, it seems to me, listening to Mihai, the parallels with the High Representative are significant.
I totally agree with Mihai because, you know, to quote you, the devil lies in the detail of actually what the role of that commissioner would be, how it will be linking to other roles, actually what will be the mandate, what actually the member states will be agreeing on when it comes to the strategic agenda. I think we will clearly have a discussion about that already in April. Let's see what will come out of that when the European Council agrees to that strategic agenda. But what I worry about is that actually, because it is so easy to say we will have a commissioner for defense, and it's also, by the way, easily conveyable, it is going to be something which will be high on the agenda when it comes to the election campaign from a good number of parties, especially on the conservative side. The EPP is already running with this as a key message which is sending out. My fear is that yes, there will be agreement on that. There will be a commissioner, but actually that will not then hide from the fact that we're not taking the decision we actually need to take. And because then it would be counterproductive.
That would give the illusion of progress, not real progress.
Exactly, the progress illusion, as Fabian would now say. There is the danger that happens, that we hide behind the defense commissioner while actually not doing the things we need to do. And when I say we, I look especially into member states, and especially in those member states which are not close to Ukraine, where the support for all this is much less than it is the closer you get to the eastern borders of the European Union.
Thank you very much to you both. We are out of time. I suspect we will come back to this in June when they come back to it. Mihai, it's been lovely to have you at Update. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just to draw your attention before we close to a few publications, one of the issues mentioned in the summit conclusions was the question of sanctions against Russia and their enforcement. The recent publication from the EPC called The Cost of Aggression, EU Sanctions Against Russia 2 years on. There's also been a second paper co-authored by Janis on the work of the EU Democracy Reform Observatory, looking at participatory democracy at the EU level, and it says how to break the invisible ceiling. Do take a look. And coming up, we didn't have time to talk. There wasn't much substantive discussion about migration at this summit, although it is referenced in the conclusions. But there is a second commentary in a series written by MEPs on the new pact on migration and asylum coming up. So do look out for those. And 2 events next week before you all begin to think about Easter eggs and a break from all this. One is on undoing the illiberal state in Poland, first lessons and challenges, and another on climate action across the globe, exploring the EU's role in the G7 and the G20. That's it from us for now. We will be back after that special EU summit towards middle of April to bring you our analysis of that on, I think it is April the 19th in the afternoon. But in the meantime, thank you, Mihai, very much for joining us today. Thank you to Amanda for her contributions earlier. Janis, as always, a pleasure. But most of all, thank you to all of you for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.